For most of this war, Russia has fought with an extraordinary geographic advantage. Ukraine's cities, power plants, railways, ports, factories, and homes have existed within range of Russian missiles and drones. Much of Russia's own industrial system, by contrast, sat hundreds or even thousands of kilometers behind the battlefield. The Kremlin could send men and ammunition toward Ukraine while large parts of the Russian economy continued operating far from the immediate physical consequences of the invasion. That separation is now becoming much harder to maintain. Ukraine is not breaking through the Russian army in some spectacular armored offensive. It has not destroyed Russia's ability to wage war. And Crimea has not been completely severed from the Russian mainland. But something important has changed. The battlefield is no longer confined to the battlefield. Ukrainian drones are reaching refineries deep inside Russia. Fuel shortages have spread across multiple Russian regions. Moscow has restricted fuel exports, brought in supplies from neighboring states, and has now even begun receiving gasoline originating in India. At the same time, Ukrainian unmanned forces have turned the Sea of Azov, once one of Russia's comparatively protected logistical spaces, into another contested zone. And Crimea sits directly inside that pressure system. That creates a strategic problem Vladimir Putin cannot solve simply by capturing another village in Donbass. Because the central question of this phase of the war is no longer just how much territory Russia can take. It is how much of Russia's rear Ukraine can make function like a front. That distinction matters. On the ground, the war remains brutally difficult for Ukraine. Russian forces continue attacking across the east, and pressure around the Donbass fortress belt has not disappeared. Kostiantynivka and the approaches towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk remain dangerous. Russia still possesses enormous advantages in manpower, glide bombs, artillery, missiles, and the ability to absorb losses that would cripple many other armies. Yet those advantages have repeatedly failed to produce the kind of operational breakthrough Moscow needs. The front moves. But it moves slowly. And when armies cannot easily create decisive results by maneuvering through enemy defensive lines, they begin looking for another way to change the balance. Ukraine's answer has increasingly been to attack the system behind the Russian soldier. Not only the soldier himself. A Russian infantry unit fighting in occupied Ukraine is the visible end of an enormous chain. Its vehicles require fuel. Its drones require components. Its artillery requires ammunition. Its officers require communications. Its replacements must travel forward. Damaged equipment must travel backward. Food, lubricants, generators, spare parts, medical supplies, engineering materials, and thousands of other items have to move through roads, railways, ports, depots, pipelines, bridges, warehouses, and distribution hubs. Destroying one tank removes one tank. Disrupting the network that keeps hundreds of tanks, trucks, generators, ships, and military facilities supplied creates a different kind of problem. That is the logic behind Ukraine's expanding long-range campaign. Russian oil infrastructure is particularly attractive because fuel connects the military and civilian economies at the same time. Russia is one of the world's great energy producers. That does not mean refined fuel automatically appears wherever it is needed. Crude oil has to be processed. Refineries have finite capacity. Individual processing units can be damaged. Repairs require specialized equipment. Fuel then has to be moved through a vast country to military formations, airports, ports, civilian filling stations, agricultural producers, trucking companies, and industrial consumers. Ukraine does not need to eliminate Russian oil production to create pressure. It only has to repeatedly disrupt enough critical nodes to force the Russian system to compensate. And compensation has a cost. A refinery goes offline, and production must shift elsewhere. A region loses supply, and fuel must travel farther. Domestic shortages emerge, and exports may have to be restricted. Imports become necessary. Transportation costs rise. Air defense assets have to protect facilities hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. Repairs consume money, specialists, and equipment. Then Ukraine attacks again. This is why the gasoline shortage inside Russia matters far beyond images of queues at filling stations. Those queues are not themselves a military victory. They are evidence that a military campaign is beginning to impose measurable friction on a much larger economic system. And Crimea may be where that logic becomes even more consequential. Since Russia seized and annexed the peninsula in 2014, Crimea has served several functions at once. It is a political symbol. It is a military platform. It supports air operations. It supports naval activity. It connects Russian power to occupied southern Ukraine. And after the full-scale invasion began, it became part of a broader logistical architecture supporting Russian forces across the southern theater. For years, Ukraine attacked individual components of that architecture: the Black Sea Fleet, airfields, ammunition sites, command facilities, the Kerch Bridge, and Russian military positions across the peninsula. The newer approach is broader. Rather than asking only, "What military target can we destroy in Crimea?" Ukraine is increasingly asking a more dangerous question. What does Crimea require in order to remain useful to Russia? Fuel is one answer. Transportation is another. Safe maritime access is another. Reliable roads and railways are another. The ability to move supplies without every tanker, depot, truck column, or transfer point becoming a potential target is another. That is why the fighting in the Sea of Azov deserves much more attention than the number of individual ships struck. Ukraine's unmanned forces say they have attacked large numbers of Russian tankers, cargo vessels, and support ships operating in the region. The precise scale of damage is difficult to establish independently, and Ukrainian claims should not automatically be treated as confirmed losses. But the operational logic is clear. Russia has used smaller vessels in the Azov system to move fuel and cargo between ports and connect those movements with the larger Black Sea transportation network. If those vessels can no longer operate safely, Russia does not simply lose ships. It loses flexibility. Cargo has to be rerouted. Ship movements become slower or more dangerous. Insurance and operational risks increase. Alternative routes become more important. And those alternative routes, particularly road and rail links through occupied southern Ukraine, are themselves increasingly exposed to Ukrainian drones. This is what makes the campaign different from a collection of spectacular strikes. Ukraine is trying to create a network problem. Hit the refinery. Pressure fuel production. Hit the tanker. Pressure maritime distribution. Hit the depot. Pressure storage. Hit the road or railway node. Pressure the alternative route. Force Russia to reroute. Then attack the route created by the rerouting. If that cycle can be repeated faster than Russia can repair, defend, substitute, and adapt, the cumulative effect can become far larger than any single explosion. But there is an enormous difference between creating friction and creating strategic collapse. Russia is vast. Its energy system has redundancy. Its military has adapted before. It can import fuel, shift production, increase protection, change routes, disperse supplies, use deception, expand electronic warfare, and retaliate against Ukrainian infrastructure. And Russia is retaliating. While Ukraine attacks Russian energy and logistics, Moscow continues striking Ukrainian cities, ports, industrial facilities, and an energy system that is preparing for another dangerous winter. So this is not a story about one side discovering an unbeatable weapon. It is a contest between two systems trying to make the other system fail first. And that changes how we should understand what is happening now. The most important question is not whether a Ukrainian drone can fly 2,000 kilometers. Ukraine has already demonstrated that it can reach deep inside Russia. The important question is what happens after the drone arrives. Can repeated refinery strikes produce shortages faster than Russia can restore capacity? Can maritime attacks make supplying Crimea sufficiently expensive and unreliable to change Russian military operations? Can Ukraine turn tactical disruption into operational constraint? And most importantly, can operational constraint eventually become strategic leverage? Because if the answer is yes, then Ukraine may have found a way to attack one of Russia's greatest advantages in this war without first having to defeat the Russian army head-on. To understand whether that is actually happening, we have to begin with the system Ukraine chose to attack first. Russia's fuel machine. Russia's fuel system looks, at first glance, like an almost impossible target. This is a country built around hydrocarbons. Russia extracts enormous quantities of crude oil, operates a large refining industry, exports energy across several continents, and possesses an internal transportation network designed to move fuel across distances measured not in hundreds, but thousands of kilometers. That scale is precisely why the early Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries were easy to dismiss. One refinery was hit. Then another. Some processing units stopped operating temporarily. Others were repaired. Russian officials could argue that production would be shifted, damage absorbed, and the system restored. Taken individually, most of those strikes were not decisive. But Ukraine was not attacking an individual refinery problem. It was trying to create an accumulation problem. Oil and gasoline are often discussed as though they were interchangeable. They are not. Having crude oil underground does not mean having gasoline available at a filling station, aviation fuel at an airbase, or diesel available for military transport. Crude has to reach a refinery. The refinery has to process it through specialized units. Those units have to remain operational. The resulting products have to be stored. They then have to be transported to distribution centers and finally delivered to the places where they are consumed. Every stage creates another dependency. And unlike crude production, refining is concentrated in a relatively limited number of large industrial facilities. That concentration gives Ukraine something it desperately needs in a war against a much larger state: targets whose economic importance is disproportionate to their physical footprint. A refinery may occupy a huge industrial site, but much of its value depends on specialized processing units that are far harder to replace than ordinary buildings. A drone does not need to erase the entire complex from the map. It needs to damage the right equipment. That distinction becomes even more important under sanctions. Modern refineries are complicated systems assembled from pumps, compressors, columns, furnaces, control systems, catalysts, electrical infrastructure, and specialized components. Some can be repaired domestically. Others are much harder to replace quickly. So when repeated attacks hit the same industry, the relevant question is no longer simply how many refineries were struck. It becomes how much usable capacity is offline at the same time, how quickly damaged units can return, and whether the repair rate can keep pace with the strike rate. By mid-2026, that balance had begun moving in an uncomfortable direction for Moscow. Russian refinery throughput had fallen toward levels not seen in roughly 2 decades. Seaborne exports of refined petroleum products dropped sharply in July. Domestic gasoline supplies tightened. Regional shortages appeared. And Moscow responded in ways that revealed the problem was no longer theoretical. Fuel exports were restricted. Quality standards were relaxed. Imports increased. Belarus and Kazakhstan became more important suppliers. And by August, gasoline originating in India was being delivered into Russia for domestic distribution. None of those measures means Russia is running out of fuel. But that is not the strategic threshold Ukraine needs to reach. The threshold is forcing Russia to spend increasingly more effort simply preserving a system that previously functioned with far less pressure. That produces what military planners would call opportunity costs. Every additional air defense system deployed around a refinery is an air defense system unavailable somewhere else. Every electronic warfare unit protecting an oil facility is protecting that facility instead of another target. Every repair crew working on damaged processing equipment is solving a problem created by Ukraine rather than improving Russia's existing infrastructure. Every imported shipment carries a transportation cost. Every rerouted fuel train occupies rail capacity. Every regional shortage creates political pressure that Moscow has to manage. And every new defensive requirement expands the geographic problem. This is where Russia's enormous size begins to work against it. The same strategic depth that once protected Russian industry now creates a vast defensive perimeter. Ukraine does not have to penetrate one integrated air defense bubble surrounding a compact industrial zone. Russian refineries, depots, terminals, pipelines, ports, and storage facilities are dispersed across an enormous territory. Defending all of them simultaneously is extremely difficult. A long-range drone is comparatively cheap. The infrastructure it threatens is not. And Ukraine can choose where the next attack occurs. Russia has to worry about where it might occur. That asymmetry does not make Ukrainian strikes unstoppable. Russian forces have adapted continuously throughout the war. They use electronic warfare. They improve detection. They deploy mobile firing groups. They reposition air defenses. Facilities construct barriers and protective structures. Flight routes can be monitored. Industrial systems can be dispersed where possible. Repairs become faster as experience accumulates. But every adaptation has limits because the attacker is adapting too. Longer-range drones appear. Navigation improves. Routes change. Decoys complicate interception. Mass attacks force defenders to choose which targets matter most. And as Ukrainian production expands, the economics of interception become increasingly uncomfortable. Russia can destroy many incoming drones and still lose strategically important equipment if only a small percentage reach their targets. This creates a war of replacement rates. How quickly can Ukraine produce and launch long-range strike systems? How quickly can Russia detect and destroy them? How quickly can Russian industry repair the resulting damage? And how quickly can alternative sources replace the refined products temporarily removed from the system? That is the real contest. Not one spectacular explosion. Rates. Ukraine's strategy only works if disruption accumulates faster than Russia can absorb it. This is also why the effect on ordinary Russians matters strategically, even though civilian inconvenience should not be confused with battlefield success. For years, the Kremlin was able to separate the psychological experience of the war. The front was violent. Russian border regions were exposed. Military families suffered losses. But for much of the population farther from Ukraine, daily life could remain surprisingly normal. That normality was politically valuable. A government fighting a long war has two broad ways of sustaining public tolerance. It can generate enthusiasm, or it can minimize the amount of sacrifice that most citizens are asked to notice. Russia has relied heavily on the second. Contract soldiers and large financial bonuses reduced the immediate political need for another mass mobilization. Energy revenues helped finance government spending. Imported consumer goods were replaced through alternative channels. And the physical destruction of the war remained overwhelmingly concentrated outside Russia's core population centers. Ukraine cannot easily change all of that. But fuel shortages penetrate daily life in a way that casualty statistics or distant battlefield maps often do not. A damaged refinery becomes a restricted filling station. A restricted filling station becomes a delayed delivery. A delayed delivery affects businesses, agriculture, transportation, construction, prices, local governments. Eventually, a drone launched from Ukraine can create a small economic consequence more than 1,000 kilometers away without ever striking a military formation. That does not automatically produce anti-war sentiment. Societies can tolerate enormous hardship during wartime. Governments can redirect anger. Propaganda can blame the enemy. Shortages can be temporary. And Russia retains substantial capacity to intervene through subsidies, imports, reserves, regulation, and administrative pressure. It would therefore be a mistake to draw a straight line from gasoline shortages to political instability. Ukraine is not one refinery strike away from forcing Putin to end the war. But the political effect does not have to be revolutionary to matter. It only has to make the war more expensive to manage. The Kremlin now has to defend not simply occupied territory and military formations, but also the expectation that the Russian state can protect its own economic infrastructure. That expectation sits close to the core of Vladimir Putin's political identity. For decades, his system has presented itself not necessarily as democratic or liberal, but as competent, predictable, controlled. The state may demand obedience, but in return it promises order. A government built on that bargain becomes particularly sensitive to visible demonstrations that it cannot fully control events. The strategic value of Ukraine's refinery campaign therefore exists on several levels at once. Militarily, it threatens the fuel networks supporting Russian operations. Economically, it damages productive infrastructure and forces expensive compensation. Geographically, it stretches Russian air defense across an enormous territory. Politically, it makes the consequences of the war more visible inside Russia. And psychologically, it undermines the distinction between a protected Russian rear and a vulnerable Ukrainian front. But the strongest version of the strategy requires more than pressure inside Russia. Refineries are only the beginning of the chain. Fuel still has to reach the places where Russian power depends on it most. And nowhere is that supply problem more geographically concentrated than Crimea. The peninsula cannot refine its way out of isolation. Everything Russia wants Crimea to do depends on connections beyond Crimea itself. The Black Sea matters. The Sea of Azov matters. The Kerch Strait matters. Railways matter. Roads matter. Ports matter. Fuel storage matters. Occupied southern Ukraine matters. The moment Ukraine began attacking those connections as parts of one system rather than as isolated targets, the strategic problem changed again. Because destroying Russian fuel production is extraordinarily difficult. Making one peninsula increasingly difficult to supply is a much narrower objective. And that is where Ukraine's long-range campaign began moving from economic pressure towards something much closer to a blockade. A blockade does not have to begin with warships. It can begin with a tanker that no longer wants to sail. A railway bridge that has to be inspected before the next train crosses. A fuel depot that cannot hold as much fuel as it did yesterday. A convoy that now travels at night. A port that requires additional air defense. A road that suddenly has to carry traffic originally meant for another route. None of these changes, by itself, cuts Crimea off. Together, they explain what Ukraine is trying to do. Crimea is a peninsula, but Russia has spent more than a decade trying to make it function as though it were not. After the annexation in 2014, Moscow invested heavily in eliminating the geographic weakness created by Crimea's dependence on outside connections. The most famous answer was the Kerch Bridge. Opened in stages beginning in 2018, the bridge gave Russia a direct road and rail connection across the Kerch Strait. Its political symbolism was obvious. Its logistical importance was even greater. Trains could move heavy cargo. Trucks could move supplies. Civilian traffic could cross without depending entirely on ferries. Russia had physically connected the peninsula to its own transportation network. Then the full-scale invasion transformed the problem again. When Russian forces occupied large parts of southern Ukraine in 2022, Moscow gained something it had not possessed before: a continuous land corridor. Russian-controlled territory now stretched from the Donbass through the Azov coast toward Crimea. Melitopol became a critical junction. Mariupol was absorbed into the new transportation network. Roads running along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov created alternative routes. Railways could be restored, expanded, or redirected. Ports such as Mariupol and Berdyansk could be integrated into the occupied economy. The result was redundancy. And redundancy is one of the most important concepts in logistics. If the Kerch Bridge becomes dangerous, use the land corridor. If rail capacity is reduced, shift some cargo to trucks. If a maritime route becomes unreliable, increase land transportation. If one depot is hit, disperse fuel into smaller sites. If one bridge is damaged, reroute traffic through another crossing. Russia understood the vulnerability. So it built alternatives. This is why describing Crimea as already isolated would be misleading. It is not. Russia still possesses multiple ways to supply the peninsula. The real Ukrainian objective is much harder than destroying one bridge. Ukraine is trying to reduce the efficiency of all those alternatives at the same time. That means the Kerch system, the Azov maritime system, the southern land corridor, rail infrastructure inside Crimea, fuel storage, electrical infrastructure, military airfields, command and surveillance systems, and the air defenses protecting all of them. Think of this not as cutting one rope, but as forcing Russia to hold an increasing number of ropes under tension. The Kerch Bridge demonstrates the problem perfectly. Ukraine has attacked the bridge before. In October 2022, an explosion damaged the road span and ignited a fuel train. In July 2023, another attack damaged the road section. Later, Ukrainian operations continued threatening the bridge and the infrastructure around it. But Russia repaired it. That matters. The bridge is vulnerable. It is not disposable. Ukraine learned that damaging a prestigious structure does not automatically eliminate a logistical network. Russia can repair. Russia can protect. Russia can restrict traffic. Russia can compensate. So the strategic question became broader. What if the bridge is only one part of the target? That is where the campaign of 2026 becomes more interesting. Ukrainian strikes increasingly concentrated not simply on famous targets, but on the connective tissue around Crimea. Rail bridges, electrical substations, fuel terminals, tankers, patrol vessels, ports, radar systems, air defense positions, transportation nodes. The objective is not necessarily to destroy every node permanently. It is to make the network unreliable. Reliability is everything in military logistics. An army does not merely need supplies. It needs to know when those supplies will arrive. A commander planning an operation needs confidence that ammunition will be available. Fuel planners need predictable consumption and delivery schedules. Repair units need spare parts. Airbases need aviation fuel. Radar sites need electricity. Truck fleets need diesel. Ports need loading capacity. Railways need functioning bridges and signaling systems. Once reliability falls, commanders have to compensate. They stockpile more. They disperse supplies. They move earlier. They build larger safety margins. They send additional escorts. They allocate repair units. They protect routes more heavily. They reduce dependence on vulnerable nodes. Every precaution consumes resources. And every precaution can create another target. A large fuel depot is efficient. It is also visible. Disperse the fuel into dozens of smaller sites, and Ukraine has a harder targeting problem. But Russia now has a harder distribution problem. Use railways, and large quantities move efficiently. Damage a rail bridge, and that efficiency disappears. Shift the cargo to trucks, and the cargo still moves. But now Russia needs more vehicles, more drivers, more fuel, more road capacity, more maintenance, and more time. Use maritime transport, and bulk cargo can bypass some pressure on roads. Attack tankers in the Sea of Azov, and maritime traffic becomes more dangerous. Move supplies through the occupied land corridor, and that corridor becomes more important. The more important it becomes, the more valuable its bridges, junctions, rail lines, depots, and convoys become as targets. This is the logic of logistical compression. Ukraine is not trying to remove every Russian option instantly. It is trying to reduce the number of cheap, safe, efficient options until the remaining ones become increasingly expensive and vulnerable. The Sea of Azov campaign illustrates that process. For much of the war, the Sea of Azov existed in a strategic category very different from the Western Black Sea. Russia controlled its coastline. The Kerch Strait controlled access. Russian air power operated nearby. Crimea sat to the south. Occupied territories surrounded much of the northern coast. For Ukraine, projecting sustained military power into this space appeared extremely difficult. But unmanned warfare changed the relationship between geography and control. A country does not need a traditional surface fleet to threaten shipping. It needs sensors, range, targeting, cheap enough weapons, and the ability to repeat attacks. By July 2026, Ukraine's drone forces were publicly claiming strikes on dozens of vessels across the Azov and Black Sea systems. Those numbers should be treated cautiously. A vessel described as hit is not necessarily destroyed. Damage may be minor. Military statements produced during an active war are not neutral assessments. But even Russian authorities confirmed individual incidents. And commercial shipping behavior revealed something larger. Operations in the Sea of Azov became restricted. The reason this matters is not that Ukraine has suddenly achieved uncontested control of the sea. It has not. What Ukraine has done is challenge Russia's assumption of sanctuary. That is a different achievement. Sea control is expensive. Sea denial can be much cheaper. To control a body of water, you generally need the ability to operate there persistently while preventing the enemy from doing the same. To deny it, you only need to make enemy operations sufficiently dangerous that they become constrained. Ukraine has already demonstrated this logic once in the Western Black Sea. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia's Black Sea fleet appeared to hold an overwhelming conventional advantage. Ukraine possessed almost no conventional navy capable of challenging it ship for ship. Yet Ukrainian anti-ship missiles, maritime drones, air attacks, and strikes against Crimean naval infrastructure gradually imposed enough risk that Russia relocated significant naval assets away from Sevastopol. The fleet was not destroyed. But its operating pattern changed. That is the model Ukraine now appears to be applying farther east. Not necessarily destroy every tanker. Instead, make every tanker part of the threat calculation. That distinction is crucial. Suppose 10 vessels sail and Ukraine damages 1. From a purely tactical perspective, Russia still moved most of the cargo. But the next 10 voyages are now planned differently. Routes change. Departure times change. Protective measures increase. Crews become more cautious. Ports may limit activity. Escort requirements grow. Insurance costs rise for commercial operators. Loading schedules become less predictable. The defender begins paying for the possibility of the next strike before the next strike even happens. Ukraine gains leverage from attacks it has not yet launched. But maritime pressure alone cannot isolate Crimea. Russia's most important insurance policy is the land corridor running through occupied southern Ukraine. And Moscow has been strengthening it precisely because the Kerch Bridge and maritime routes are vulnerable. New and repaired roads, railways, ports, and transport links increasingly integrate occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson with Crimea and Russia. This network has military value, but its purpose is larger. Russia is attempting to make the occupation structurally permanent. Infrastructure does that. A road changes where commerce moves. A railway changes where factories source materials. A port changes which markets a region faces. Administrative systems follow transport systems. Economic integration follows physical integration. Over time, occupation becomes less dependent on one dramatic choke point and more embedded in an entire network. For Ukraine, that creates a brutal strategic dilemma. The longer Russia holds the land corridor, the harder Crimea becomes to isolate through attacks on the Kerch Strait alone. But the same network that makes Russia more resilient also creates thousands of kilometers of infrastructure that must be defended. And some nodes remain far more important than others. Railways are especially valuable. A military can move extraordinary quantities of material by rail far more efficiently than by truck. Heavy equipment, ammunition, fuel, engineering supplies, replacement vehicles, all can move in bulk. That makes railway junctions and bridges natural targets. During July and early August, Ukrainian forces repeatedly targeted rail infrastructure connecting occupied southern Ukraine and Crimea, including the Sivash crossing near Konhar, and railway infrastructure deeper inside the peninsula. Again, a damaged bridge is not the same thing as a permanently severed route. Repair crews can restore it. Traffic can be rerouted. Temporary solutions can be built. But repeated strikes change the equation. The defender no longer asks, "Can we repair this?" It asks, "How long will this repair remain useful before it is attacked again?" That is a much more difficult problem. Ukraine is essentially trying to increase the maintenance burden of occupation. Russia built infrastructure to reduce Crimea's isolation. Ukraine attacks infrastructure to restore part of that isolation. Russia creates redundancy. Ukraine searches for the redundancy. Russia reroutes. Ukraine follows the rerouting. Russia hardens a node. Ukraine searches for a softer one. This is not a conventional blockade. It is a contest between network construction and network destruction. And the outcome cannot be measured simply by counting explosions. The important metric is whether Crimea becomes progressively more expensive, slower, and less reliable as a platform for Russian military power. That qualification matters because Crimea still functions. Russian bases still operate there. Russian logistics still reach the peninsula. The land corridor remains open. The Kerch connection still exists. Russia retains substantial military infrastructure. There is no evidence that Russian forces in Crimea are on the verge of being starved into surrender. Ukraine has therefore not achieved isolation in the classical sense. What it may be creating is something strategically subtler. Partial isolation. A peninsula supplied through routes that technically remain open but are increasingly contested. A naval base that remains operational but is less secure. Fuel that still arrives, but through a system requiring more protection and rerouting. Railways that still move cargo, but whose bridges have become recurring targets. Air defense systems forced to protect infrastructure behind the front instead of concentrating exclusively on frontline formations. That is the distinction between access and reliable access. Russia still has access to Crimea. Ukraine is attacking the reliability. And if that reliability continues to deteriorate, the consequences would extend well beyond the peninsula itself. Because Crimea is not only something Russia has to supply. Crimea helps supply Russia's war. Which means the real test of Ukraine's campaign is not whether it can inconvenience Crimea. It is whether pressure on Crimea can begin weakening Russian operations across the entire southern theater. If the campaign against Crimea is strategically important, then eventually its effects have to appear somewhere beyond Crimea. Otherwise, Ukraine is simply destroying infrastructure. The southern battlefield is the test. Russia's positions across occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson do not exist independently of the peninsula behind them. Crimea supports the theater through transportation, aviation, command infrastructure, storage, communications, and the broader logistical network connecting southern Ukraine to Russian territory. But this does not mean every Russian unit in the south receives every shell or liter of fuel directly from Crimea. That would be too simple. Russia has spent 4 years building overlapping supply systems. Cargo can enter the occupied territories from the east through Donetsk. It can move south from Russia through the Azov corridor. It can arrive through Crimea. It can use rail. It can use roads. It can move by sea. Individual formations can maintain local stocks. Field depots can be dispersed. The entire structure is designed so that the loss of one route does not automatically stop an army. That is why there has been no dramatic moment in which Russian forces suddenly run out of fuel and abandon the southern front. Instead, the effects of interdiction appear first as friction. A delivery takes longer. A depot has to be relocated. A railway operates below optimal capacity. A truck route becomes more important. A unit receives less flexibility in when it can move. An air defense battery is moved backward to defend a logistical node. A reserve of fuel that could support an offensive instead becomes a buffer against interrupted deliveries. These are small changes. But operational warfare is often determined by the accumulation of small changes. An army attempting a breakthrough needs more than soldiers at the front. It needs concentration. Before an offensive begins, ammunition has to accumulate. Fuel stocks have to rise. Engineering equipment has to move forward. Reserve units have to assemble. Bridging equipment, recovery vehicles, medical support, communication systems, and replacement vehicles all have to be positioned. That concentration creates a logistical signature. More trains. More trucks. More storage. More movement through predictable junctions. More fuel near the front. More opportunities to strike. The defender's objective is therefore not always to stop the offensive after it begins. It can try to make concentration difficult enough that the offensive never achieves the mass originally intended. Ukraine has learned this lesson the hard way. Russian drones, missiles, reconnaissance systems, and glide bombs have repeatedly punished Ukrainian attempts to concentrate forces. Large formations become targets. Major depots become targets. Airfields become targets. Vehicles moving along predictable routes become targets. Ukraine has been forced to disperse. Now it is attempting to impose a similar problem on Russia's rear. The result is a battlefield where both armies increasingly struggle to create concentration without exposing themselves. That helps explain one of the defining characteristics of the war in 2026. There are advances. There are counterattacks. Settlements change hands. Russian forces continue pushing in the east and southeast. Ukraine has also regained territory in several sectors. But neither side has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to convert local gains into a rapid operational collapse of the opposing front. The battlefield moves in kilometers when commanders would prefer it to move in tens or hundreds of kilometers. Drones are one reason. Minefields are another. Artillery remains important. Precision strike systems matter. Fortifications matter. Manpower matters. But logistics sits underneath all of them. If both sides can see much of the battlefield and attack concentrations behind it, then the ability to move supplies quietly, rapidly, and redundantly becomes one of the central determinants of offensive power. This is where Crimea matters. A secure Crimea gives Russia depth. A contested Crimea consumes depth. The distinction is subtle but important. Before Ukrainian long-range attacks became persistent, Russian commanders could treat many facilities on the peninsula as rear-area infrastructure. An airfield was behind the front. A fuel depot was behind the front. A railway junction was behind the front. A radar installation was behind the front. The further these sites were from Ukrainian ground forces, the safer they appeared. Long-range drones collapsed that assumption. Distance no longer creates sanctuary in the same way. Now a facility hundreds of kilometers from the line of contact may face many of the same pressures as infrastructure much closer to it. That changes Russian deployment decisions. Take air defense. Russia possesses sophisticated systems. But sophisticated does not mean unlimited. S-300 and S-400 batteries, Panzer systems, electronic warfare units, radars, mobile teams, and other defensive assets all have to be distributed according to priority. Protect an airbase. Protect the Kerch Strait. Protect a refinery. Protect a headquarters. Protect a port. Protect a power substation. Protect a railway hub. Protect an ammunition depot. Protect a city. Protect another refinery. Then another one. Ukraine's advantage does not come from proving Russian air defense is ineffective. Russian air defenses destroy large numbers of Ukrainian drones. The advantage comes from forcing Russia to decide what cannot be left undefended. Every protected target reveals something about Russian priorities. Every unprotected target reveals a vulnerability. And when Ukraine attacks air defense systems themselves, it can create temporary openings through which later strikes become more dangerous. This is why the campaign in Crimea has increasingly combined different target categories. Radar first. Then air defense. Then energy. Then logistics. Then airfield. Then another logistical node. The point is not simply destruction. The point is sequencing. A radar system helps detect incoming threats. Destroy or suppress it, and another target becomes easier to reach. Damage electrical infrastructure, and military facilities require backup power or repairs. Hit fuel storage, and aircraft or vehicles have to draw supply from somewhere else. Strike that replacement supply route, and the second problem compounds the first. This is how tactical attacks can begin producing operational effects. But only if they are sustained. And sustainability is Ukraine's largest uncertainty. A campaign of this kind consumes enormous numbers of drones. It requires engines, explosives, navigation systems, communications equipment, airframes, electronic components, targeting intelligence, launch crews, production facilities, money, and time. Ukraine's commander of unmanned forces has publicly argued that the Crimea campaign remains far below its potential because financing and production capacity still constrain the number of systems available. That claim comes from a Ukrainian commander and should be understood as such. But the underlying limitation is real. Ukraine cannot simply choose to attack every Russian target every night. Resources have to be allocated. A drone sent toward a refinery in Bashkortostan cannot simultaneously strike a railway in Crimea. A missile fired at an air defense system cannot be used against an ammunition depot. Intelligence collection also has limits. The longer the target list becomes, the more difficult prioritization becomes. And Russia understands this. The defender does not necessarily have to stop every Ukrainian strike. It may only need to prevent enough strikes from producing cumulative failure. Repair faster. Disperse more effectively. Add redundancy. Move stockpiles. Build new rail connections. Increase local storage. Deploy decoys. Improve electronic warfare. Change the timing of shipments. Use civilian infrastructure where possible. Create enough alternatives that Ukraine spends weapons without collapsing the system. This becomes another race of rates. Ukraine tries to increase the rate of disruption. Russia tries to increase the rate of recovery. The battlefield result depends on which curve rises faster. So far, Russia is still recovering. That fact must remain central to any realistic assessment. Crimea is under pressure. It is not paralyzed. Russian military facilities still operate from the peninsula. The land corridor remains functional. Russian forces in southern Ukraine continue fighting. Moscow retains the ability to attack Zaporizhia, Kherson, Odessa, and other Ukrainian targets. And Russian troops have not been forced into a general retreat because of Ukrainian interdiction. In fact, Russia has responded by applying its own version of the same logic. Ukraine attacks Russian logistics. Russia attacks Ukrainian logistics. Ukraine attacks Russian fuel. Russia attacks Ukrainian energy. Ukraine attacks Russian shipping. Russia attacks Ukrainian ports. Ukraine tries to make Crimea more difficult to supply. Russia tries to make the Ukrainian economy more difficult to sustain. This is why the escalating battle over the Black Sea matters so much. After Ukrainian attacks disrupted Russian shipping in the Sea of Azov and Black Sea, Russia intensified strikes against Ukrainian ports around Odessa and Chornomorsk. Ships were damaged. Port infrastructure was hit. Storage facilities were attacked. Commercial operators became more cautious. Ukraine's grain exports came under renewed pressure. Russia was delivering a message through military means. If Ukraine turns maritime logistics into a battlefield, Moscow can do the same. And in some respects, Ukraine is more vulnerable. Russia is a much larger economy. It possesses larger energy reserves. Its transportation network has greater depth. Its population is larger. Its industrial base can absorb more physical damage. Ukraine has already lost substantial infrastructure during years of war. Its energy grid has repeatedly been attacked. Its ports are essential for exports. Its cities remain within range of Russian ballistic missiles and drones. Its air defense interceptor supply remains a persistent problem. The strategic contest is therefore deeply asymmetric. Ukraine may be able to impose new costs on Russia. But Russia can impose devastating costs in return. This creates the central paradox of Ukraine's long-range strategy. The campaign is succeeding enough to matter, but not yet enough to decide the war. Russian trucking costs have risen as fuel prices increased. Some companies have shortened routes or shifted cargo toward rail and ports. Russian refinery operations have faced repeated disruption. Maritime traffic has been constrained. Crimean infrastructure has been hit repeatedly. Russian air defenses are being stretched across an expanding target set. These are measurable changes. But none of them has yet produced the strategic conversion Ukraine ultimately needs. That conversion would look different. It would mean Russian formations receiving supplies too slowly to sustain planned operations. It would mean airbases reducing sortie generation because fuel, maintenance, or protection became inadequate. It would mean the land corridor carrying so much rerouted traffic that key nodes became chronic bottlenecks. It would mean Russian commanders being forced to choose between supporting one theater and another. It would mean infrastructure repairs falling behind destruction. It would mean Russia losing the ability to restore normality before the next round of strikes. That is the threshold between harassment and interdiction. Between interdiction and isolation. Between isolation and strategic effect. Ukraine is somewhere along that chain. Exactly where is difficult to measure from outside. But one development suggests the campaign has already crossed an important boundary. Russia is no longer reacting only at the military level. The effects are spreading into the civilian economy. Fuel prices are altering commercial transport. Long-haul trucking has become more expensive. Some Russian logistics companies are changing how far they are willing to move cargo. Freight costs are rising. The state is importing fuel and changing regulations to stabilize supply. And Ukrainian weapons are reaching industrial sites at distances that once appeared safely outside the war. This does not mean the Russian economy is collapsing. It means the cost of maintaining the distinction between front and rear is rising. For Putin, that may become the most dangerous transformation of all. Because the war he launched was designed around the assumption that Russia possessed strategic depth while Ukraine did not. Russia could destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. Russia could strike Ukrainian cities. Russia could damage Ukrainian energy production. Russia could force Ukraine to fight under permanent threat, while most Russians remain geographically insulated from comparable danger. Ukraine is now attacking that asymmetry directly. Not by matching Russia missile for missile. Not by destroying the Russian army in one decisive battle. But by steadily expanding the geographic area in which Russia must defend itself. And once the rear becomes part of the battlefield, the question changes again. It is no longer simply whether Ukraine can reach Russia. It clearly can. The question is whether Russia can continue expanding the war abroad while the costs of protecting the state at home continue rising. That is where the military problem begins becoming a political one. Political pressure is not the same thing as political collapse. That distinction is essential. Fuel shortages have created frustration inside Russia. Ukrainian drones have demonstrated that facilities far from the Ukrainian border are no longer automatically safe. The costs of the war are becoming harder for ordinary Russians to ignore. But Vladimir Putin is not facing an imminent revolution. There are no mass demonstrations threatening the Kremlin. The Russian state retains powerful instruments of repression. Independent political activity has been heavily restricted. The media environment is tightly controlled. And even after several months of economic pressure, a large share of the Russian population still expresses support for the president and the armed forces. That is why the correct question is not, will gasoline shortages overthrow Putin? They almost certainly will not. The better question is, how much political room does Putin lose as the war requires progressively more sacrifice from people who were previously insulated from it? That is a much more important problem. The Kremlin has spent years trying to prevent the war from becoming equally costly for every part of Russian society. The first major mobilization in September 2022 demonstrated why. Hundreds of thousands of men were called into military service. Hundreds of thousands more Russians left the country. The mobilization produced fear, administrative chaos, and one of the clearest moments of public anxiety since the invasion began. Moscow learned from that experience. Instead of relying on another immediate nationwide mobilization, the state increasingly relied on money. Signing bonuses increased. Regional governments offered enormous payments relative to local salaries. Debt relief, family benefits, and other incentives helped attract recruits. The burden was distributed unevenly. Poorer regions supplied disproportionate numbers of soldiers. For many families, military service became financially transformative even as it remained physically dangerous. This system gave Putin something politically valuable: manpower without immediately placing the entire urban middle class under the same pressure. But that mechanism becomes harder to sustain when recruitment declines while battlefield losses continue. The price of each new soldier rises. Regional governments have to spend more. Recruiters have to search more aggressively. The pool of willing volunteers becomes more difficult to access. Eventually, the Kremlin faces a choice. Accept lower manpower levels. Increase the financial incentive again. Find new categories of recruits. Reduce battlefield ambitions. Or mobilize more men directly. The possibility of another large mobilization has therefore become one of the most important political uncertainties inside Russia. Ukraine claims its intelligence indicates that Moscow is preparing to mobilize hundreds of thousands of additional personnel after Russia's September parliamentary elections. That claim has not been independently confirmed. Russian officials deny that another mass mobilization is imminent. But the fact that the possibility is being seriously discussed tells us something about the structural problem. Russia still needs men. Because territorial warfare consumes manpower at enormous rates. Every village captured has to be held. Every trench requires soldiers. Every assault creates casualties. Every kilometer added to the front creates another security burden. And Russia's strategy has often exchanged manpower for gradual territorial progress. That exchange works only as long as the state can continue replacing the manpower. Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure cannot directly solve Ukraine's manpower problem. But they can interact with Russia's manpower problem. That interaction is where the strategy becomes interesting. If Putin asks Russian society for another major mobilization while the same population is also dealing with fuel shortages, inflation, drone attacks, disrupted transport, and economic uncertainty, then the political cost of mobilization rises. The refinery strike and the recruiting office are therefore connected even though they are hundreds of kilometers apart. One increases the visible economic cost of the war. The other increases the visible human cost. Together, they narrow the Kremlin's ability to maintain the fiction of a distant conflict fought largely by professionals and volunteers. But Putin still possesses another option. Escalate against Ukraine. If Russia cannot prevent every Ukrainian drone from reaching its refineries, it can attempt to make Ukraine pay a much higher price for conducting the campaign. And this may be Ukraine's greatest vulnerability. Russia does not need to mirror Ukrainian attacks target for target. Its strike capacity is much larger. Russian forces can attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure, factories, railways, ports, military facilities, apartment buildings, and cities with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and large numbers of drones. Ukraine can inflict pain deep inside Russia. Russia can still inflict more destruction inside Ukraine. That asymmetry remains. And it becomes particularly dangerous as winter approaches. Ukraine's energy system has already endured years of systematic attack. Power stations have been damaged. Substations have been destroyed. Transmission infrastructure has been struck repeatedly. Repair crews restore equipment only for some sites to be attacked again. The same logic Ukraine is applying to Russian refineries is being applied by Russia against the Ukrainian electricity system. Disrupt. Repair. Strike again. Force the defender to spend resources. Reduce redundancy. Find the next vulnerable node. The difference is that Ukraine has much less strategic depth. Its power grid is smaller. Its economy is smaller. Its population has already experienced years of displacement and war. And many of its most important cities remain within easy reach of Russian missiles. Ukraine's air defense problem therefore becomes central to the entire strategy. Long-range strikes into Russia only generate strategic leverage if Ukraine can survive the retaliation. In August, that became increasingly uncertain. Patriot batteries are among Ukraine's most important defenses against Russian ballistic missiles. But a launcher without interceptors is only expensive machinery. Ukraine has repeatedly warned that its interceptor stocks are dangerously low. Recent Russian attacks have demonstrated what happens when those magazines approach empty. Ballistic missiles become dramatically more difficult to stop. Cities become more vulnerable. Power infrastructure becomes more vulnerable. And every Ukrainian strategic calculation becomes constrained by the need to preserve scarce defensive missiles for the most important targets. This is why Western support remains part of the battlefield rather than something separate from it. NATO countries have pledged tens of billions of euros in military equipment, training, and assistance. European states are assuming a larger share of Ukraine's support burden. Discussions continue over expanding production of Patriot interceptors and integrating Ukraine more deeply into Western defense manufacturing. But a pledge is not an interceptor. A production license is not a missile arriving tomorrow. A factory announced in 2026 may matter enormously in 2027 or 2028, and still do nothing for an apartment building targeted tonight. Wars are decided partly by industrial capacity. But they are also decided by timing. Ukraine needs enough long-range drones to keep pressure on Russia. Enough air defense interceptors to survive Russian retaliation. Enough soldiers to hold the front. Enough ammunition to prevent Russian breakthroughs. Enough Western financing to keep the state functioning. Enough electricity to keep cities operating through winter. And enough time for Russian vulnerabilities to accumulate. Russia faces its own version of that equation. Enough men to replace battlefield losses. Enough fuel to sustain the economy and military. Enough refinery capacity to prevent domestic shortages. Enough air defense to protect an expanding list of targets. Enough economic stability to continue funding the war. Enough public tolerance to avoid politically dangerous decisions. Enough time for Ukrainian exhaustion to deepen. That is why the war increasingly resembles two exhausted systems testing which one can absorb pressure longer. Neither side needs the other to collapse everywhere. It needs failure at the right point. For Russia, that point could be Ukraine's energy system, or Ukrainian manpower, or Western political support, or air defense depletion. For Ukraine, it could be Russian recruitment, Russian refinery capacity, Crimean logistics, the cost of maintaining occupied territory, or the political willingness of the Kremlin to continue accepting rising domestic consequences. The strategic significance of Ukraine's current campaign lies precisely here. Ukraine is expanding the number of ways Russia can fail. For much of the war, Russia possessed the initiative because it could generate pressure across multiple dimensions while Ukraine had to absorb it. Russia attacked the front. Russia attacked the power grid. Russia attacked cities. Russia pressured Ukrainian manpower. Russia attempted to isolate Ukraine economically. Russia counted on Western support eventually weakening. Ukraine's long-range campaign does not reverse all of those advantages. But it introduces new reciprocal pressures. Russia attacks Ukrainian energy. Ukraine attacks Russian refining. Russia pressures Ukrainian ports. Ukraine pressures Russian maritime logistics. Russia threatens Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukraine threatens infrastructure inside Russia. Russia tries to exhaust Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine tries to stretch Russia's air defenses across an enormous territory. And Crimea sits at the intersection of several of these pressures. This is why the phrase, "Ukraine is cutting Crimea off," must be understood carefully. Crimea is not cut off. Russian trains still move. Roads remain open. The land corridor continues functioning. Military bases remain active. Supplies still arrive. Russia retains significant forces on the peninsula. There is no classical blockade. What Ukraine is attempting is more sophisticated. It is trying to make every connection less reliable. The bridge remains, but it must be defended. The railway remains, but it can be struck. The tanker sails, but the crew now faces a drone threat. The fuel arrives, but storage becomes a target. The land corridor works, but dependence on it concentrates traffic. The refinery operates, but another attack may stop part of its capacity tomorrow. The Russian state still functions. But maintaining normal function requires more effort than before. That is the strategic change. The war has reached Russia not because Ukrainian troops are marching toward Moscow. It has reached Russia because geography no longer protects the Russian rear in the way the Kremlin expected. A refinery near the Urals can become part of the battlefield. A driver waiting for gasoline can experience a consequence of a decision made in the Kremlin 4 years earlier. A tanker in the Sea of Azov can become part of a campaign aimed at Crimea. A railway bridge hundreds of kilometers from the front line can influence how quickly a Russian formation receives supplies. And an air defense system stationed beside an oil refinery is an air defense system that had to be removed from some other priority. Ukraine is trying to convert distance from an advantage into a burden. That is the deeper logic behind the campaign. But it is not yet a victory. Russia still has greater resources. Russia still holds substantial Ukrainian territory. Russian forces continue exerting pressure along the front. Ukraine remains dependent on external military support. Its manpower problem remains severe. Its cities remain vulnerable. Its energy system faces another winter under attack. And long-range strikes cannot substitute indefinitely for holding ground. The real question is whether the new pressure can scale. If Russian refineries continue being damaged faster than they can be repaired, the fuel problem grows. If maritime attacks continue making Azov routes dangerous, the land corridor becomes more important. If the land corridor becomes more important, its transport nodes become more valuable targets. If those nodes are repeatedly disrupted, supplying Crimea becomes slower and more expensive. If Crimea becomes less reliable as a military platform, Russian operations in the south become harder to sustain. And if all of this happens while recruitment declines and domestic economic pressure rises, the Kremlin eventually faces choices it has spent years trying to avoid. But every link in that chain contains an if. Russia may adapt. Repairs may accelerate. Drone defenses may improve. New transport routes may absorb the pressure. Imports may stabilize fuel supplies. Another mobilization could provide the manpower Moscow needs. Russian attacks could devastate Ukraine's power grid before Ukraine's campaign inflicts comparable strategic damage on Russia. Western support could weaken. Ukraine could simply run out of time. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the conclusion. It is the conclusion. The war has entered a phase in which either side has found a reliable path to decisive victory, so both are trying to change the conditions under which the other can continue fighting. Russia is still trying to break Ukraine. Ukraine is increasingly trying to make Russia experience the war it believed it could keep outside its own borders. And Crimea is becoming the clearest test of whether that strategy can work. Because if Ukraine can transform Crimea from a secure Russian military hub into an increasingly expensive logistical liability, then it does not need to physically capture the peninsula to change its strategic value. And if attacks deep inside Russia can force Moscow to defend thousands of kilometers of infrastructure while simultaneously sustaining an enormous army in Ukraine, then strategic depth begins to lose part of the advantage Putin assumed it would provide. That is what has changed. The front line still matters. Territory still matters. Soldiers still matter. But the map of this war is becoming much larger than the trenches. The refineries are now on it. The tankers are on it. The railways are on it. The Russian fuel station is on it. Crimea's supply routes are on it. And increasingly, the Russian rear itself is on it. Putin began this war believing Russia could impose costs on Ukraine faster than Ukraine could impose costs on Russia. 4 years later, that assumption is finally being tested inside Russia itself. Whether Ukraine can turn that test into strategic advantage may determine what comes next. If you want to follow how this campaign develops, and whether pressure on Crimea and Russia's energy system actually begins changing the battlefield, subscribe, and we will continue tracking the war as the evidence changes.